The charity event was in full swing when David walked through the heavy oak doors of the Riverside Concert Hall. He paused for just a moment, taking in the scene before him. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the crowd of well-dressed people who mingled with champagne glasses in hand, their laughter echoing off the high ceilings. This wasn't his world, and he knew it the moment he stepped inside. David was 47 years old, with hands that told the story of a working man. His fingers were thick and scarred from years of handling lumber, steel, and concrete. His face had the kind of weathered look that comes from spending days under the sun, not in air-conditioned offices or practice rooms. Tonight he wore a dark suit jacket that his neighbor had lent him. It was slightly too big in the shoulders, but it was the best he had. He hadn't planned to come. In fact, when his daughter Amy handed him the invitation 3 weeks ago, he'd laughed and told her he had nothing to do with fancy events like this. But Amy had insisted. She'd signed him up for the open mic portion of the evening, where local people could volunteer to perform. "Just once, Dad," she'd said, her eyes pleading. "Just play one time. For me." He couldn't say no to that face. The main performance hadn't started yet. People were still arriving, greeting each other with kisses on both cheeks and compliments about dresses and jewelry. David felt a knot forming in his stomach. What was he doing here? He found a seat near the back, hoping to blend in, but even that felt wrong. The chairs were velvet-cushioned, arranged in perfect rows facing a stage where a magnificent grand piano sat under a spotlight. That piano. Even from a distance, David could see it was a beauty. The black lacquer finish gleamed like still water at midnight. It was the kind of instrument he used to dream about playing when he was younger, back when things were different. Back when his life had followed a completely different path. A woman in a red dress walked past him, and he caught a snippet of her conversation. "I heard there are some conservatory students performing tonight. Should be wonderful." Her friend nodded eagerly. These were people who understood music, who had season tickets to the symphony and could tell the difference between a good performance and a great one. David suddenly felt like an imposter. The MC, a man in his 60s with silver hair and a warm smile, stepped onto the stage. "Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our annual charity fundraiser. Tonight we're not just here to enjoy beautiful music, but to support arts education in our community." Applause filled the room. "We have a wonderful lineup of talented performers, and as always, we'll have our open mic segment where anyone brave enough can take the stage and share their gift with us." David's palms began to sweat. Anyone brave enough? That was the question, wasn't it? Was he brave enough? The first few performers were exactly what you'd expect. A young violinist who played with technical precision, a soprano who sang an aria that drew enthusiastic applause, a teenage cellist whose parents beamed with pride from the front row. They were all good. Really good. They belonged here. Then came the open mic portion. The MC smiled broadly. "Now who's feeling adventurous tonight? Don't be shy. This is a supportive crowd." A few people chuckled nervously, but no one moved. David's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. Before he could talk himself out of it, his hand went up. He wasn't even sure why. Maybe it was the memory of Amy's hopeful face. Maybe it was something deeper, something that had been buried for so long that it had become part of his bones. "Wonderful. We have a volunteer," the MC announced. "Come on up, sir." David stood up and immediately he felt eyes on him. Lots of eyes. He walked down the aisle, his work boots making soft thuds on the carpeted floor. He could hear the whispers starting, see the sideways glances. A woman in the third row leaned over to her husband and whispered something behind her hand. The husband smiled, not unkindly, but with the look of someone about to witness something amusing. As David climbed the 3 steps to the stage, he heard a giggle from somewhere in the front section. It wasn't mean-spirited exactly, but it was there. The sound of people who thought they knew what was about to happen. The construction worker who thought he could play piano. How charming. How quaint, the MC shook his hand. "And what's your name, sir?" "David. Welcome, David. And what will you be playing for us tonight?" David looked out at the audience. There must have been 200 people, maybe more. Some were genuinely curious. Others were already pulling out their phones, probably expecting to capture a moment they could share later. Look at this guy who thought he could play. Some faces showed polite encouragement, the kind you give to a child at a school recital. "Rachmaninoff," David said quietly. Prelude in C-sharp minor. A few eyebrows went up in the crowd. Someone in the audience let out a small laugh, quickly stifled. The MC's smile flickered for just a second before recovering. Well, that's quite ambitious. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give David a warm welcome. The applause was polite but thin. David walked to the piano bench and sat down. The spotlight was hot on his face, making him squint slightly. He looked down at the keys, white and black, perfectly aligned, waiting. His hands hovered above them, and he noticed how out of place they looked. These weren't the hands of a concert pianist. They were rough, calloused, with dirt under the nails that wouldn't quite wash out no matter how hard he scrubbed. Someone coughed. A chair creaked. He could feel the anticipation in the room, and it wasn't the good kind. It was the anticipation of people waiting for something to either be surprisingly good or entertainingly bad. Either way, they'd have a story to tell. David took a breath. He adjusted the bench slightly, just an inch back. His fingers stretched out, reaching for the keys, then pulled back. The room was so quiet now that he could hear the rustle of programs, the soft clearing of throats. Waiting, watching, judging. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that David had made peace with this moment 25 years ago. He'd made his choice then, and he'd lived with it every day since. This wasn't about proving anything to them. This wasn't even really about the music, though God knew how much he'd missed it. This was about keeping a promise to his daughter. This was about honoring the part of himself that he'd set aside but never quite let die. His right hand descended toward the keys, steady and sure, ready to play that first note that would change everything. 25 years ago, David's life looked completely different. He was 22 years old and sitting in a practice room at the Riverside Conservatory of Music, the same building that stood just 3 blocks from where he now sat on stage. Back then, his hands were smooth, his fingers nimble from 8 hours of daily practice. He'd been given a full scholarship, something that almost never happened for someone from his neighborhood. His teacher, an elderly woman named Professor Hartwick, used to tell him that he had something special. Not just technical skill, though, he had plenty of that. No, she said he had soul. When David played, people didn't just hear music. They felt something. She'd told him he could make a career out of this. Maybe not as a concert soloist. Those spots were rare and competitive. But as a performer, a teacher, someone who could spend their life immersed in the thing they loved most. David had believed her. He'd worked harder than anyone else in his class, staying late in the practice rooms, showing up early, treating every piece like it was the most important thing in the world. Music wasn't just something he did. It was who he was. Then came the phone call. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and he'd just finished practicing a particularly difficult passage from a Chopin nocturne. His mother's voice on the other end of the line was shaking. "You need to come to the hospital. It's your father. A stroke. Massive and devastating. The doctor said his father would survive, but he'd never be the same. The left side of his body was paralyzed. He couldn't work anymore. Couldn't drive. Needed help with everything from getting dressed to eating meals. The medical bills started piling up immediately, and their insurance covered almost nothing. David sat in that hospital room, watching his father struggle to lift a cup of water with his right hand, and he knew what he had to do. His mother worked 2 jobs already. His younger brother was still in high school. Someone had to step up, and David was the oldest. The scholarship covered his tuition, but it didn't put food on the table or pay the mortgage or cover the nursing care his father would need. He withdrew from the conservatory 3 weeks later. He didn't make a big announcement, didn't say goodbye to most of his classmates. He just quietly filled out the paperwork and walked away. Professor Hartwick tried to talk him out of it, told him there had to be another way, but David had already made up his mind. Some things were more important than dreams. A friend of his father's got him a job at a construction site. The pay was decent, and they needed workers who could start immediately. David showed up on his first day with no experience and soft hands that blistered within hours. The other workers were kind enough, showed him the ropes, taught him how to handle tools and materials. Within a year, those soft pianist hands had transformed into something else entirely, calloused, scarred, strong in a different way. He told himself it was temporary. Just a year or 2 until his father recovered a bit, until they got back on their feet financially. But recovery never came. His father's condition stabilized but never improved. The bills never stopped. His brother went to college, and David helped pay for that too. Then his mother got sick. Then he met Linda at a community event. And somehow in the middle of all the chaos, he fell in love. They got married in a small ceremony. Linda knew about his past, about the piano and the scholarship and the dream he'd given up. She tried to encourage him to go back, to find a way. But by then, David was 28, and going back felt impossible. He had responsibilities, a wife who wanted to start a family, aging parents who still needed support. The construction job had turned from temporary to permanent without him even noticing. The years passed like pages in a book, flipping faster and faster. His daughter Amy was born. His father passed away when Amy was 5. His mother followed 3 years later. David worked his way up to foreman, got a decent salary, bought a small house in a quiet neighborhood. It was a good life. Not the life he'd imagined, but good nonetheless. But the music never left him. Not really. He'd walk past music stores and his feet would slow down without him meaning to. Through the windows, he'd see the pianos lined up, and his fingers would twitch with muscle memory. Sometimes he'd stand there for 10 minutes just looking before shaking his head and moving on. Linda noticed it. She saw how he'd stop and listen whenever there was a street musician playing, how he'd turn up the radio when classical music came on, how he'd watch their daughter's piano recitals with an intensity that went beyond normal parental pride. She'd once suggested they buy a keyboard, something small and inexpensive, but David had shaken his head. "No point in torturing myself," he'd said with a sad smile. Amy asked about it once when she was 12. They were at a coffee shop and there was a piano player in the corner playing soft jazz. David had been watching the man's hands, completely absorbed, until Amy's voice broke through. "Dad, did you really used to play piano?" David had nodded. "A long time ago. Why did you stop?" How do you explain something like that to a 12-year-old? How do you tell your daughter that sometimes life requires you to set aside the things you love most? That being an adult means making choices that break your heart, but keep your family fed and safe. Sometimes, David had said carefully, dreams get put on hold, but they never really die. They just wait. Wait for what? For the right moment, I guess. Amy had looked at him with those big, serious eyes. "That sounds sad, Dad." "It's not sad," he'd told her, though part of him wondered if he was lying. "It's just life. I got other good things. I got your mom. I got you. Those are pretty great dreams that came true." But late at night, when everyone was asleep, David sometimes allowed himself to remember. He'd lie in bed and his fingers would move against the sheets, playing silent scales and arpeggios. He'd hear pieces in his head, complex and beautiful, and his body would ache with the need to bring them to life. 25 years away from a piano, and his hands still remembered every chord, every technique, every piece he'd ever learned. He never told anyone about those nights. Not even Linda. It felt too much like complaining, like being ungrateful for the life he had, so he kept it locked inside, this ghost of who he used to be, carrying it around like a photograph in his wallet that he never showed anyone. 3 months before the charity event, something changed. Amy had turned 18 and gotten into college with a partial scholarship. The construction company gave David a bonus. For the first time in decades, they had a little breathing room financially. David had started looking at used keyboards online, thinking maybe it was finally time. Nothing fancy, just something he could mess around with in the garage. He never told Amy about this, but somehow she knew. Daughters have a way of knowing things about their fathers, about seeing the parts they try to hide. And Amy had been watching her father for years, seeing the longing in his eyes every time music played, understanding that he'd sacrificed something precious for their family. So she'd done something about it. Without telling him, she'd entered his name into the charity event's open mic list. She'd found his old conservatory acceptance letter in a box in the attic and understood what it meant. She wanted to give her father one moment, just one, to be the person he'd been before life changed everything. One chance to remember what it felt like to be whole. David's right hand touched the keys first. Not pressing, just resting there, feeling the smooth coolness of the ivory under his fingertips. 25 years. That's how long it had been since he'd sat at a real piano. He'd wondered if his hands would remember, if his body would know what to do after so much time had passed. The audience was still waiting, that uncomfortable silence hanging in the air. Someone shifted in their seat. A phone buzzed and was quickly silenced. David could feel their doubt like a physical presence in the room. He understood it. A middle-aged construction worker about to play one of the most difficult pieces in classical piano repertoire. It sounded like a setup to a joke. He closed his eyes for just a moment. In that darkness, he wasn't on a stage anymore. He was back in the practice room at the conservatory, 22 years old, working through this same piece for the first time. He could almost hear Professor Hartwick's voice. "Don't think about the notes, David, feel them. Let your body remember what your mind might forget." His fingers found their position. The opening of Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor starts with 3 heavy, ominous chords. They need to be played with weight, with certainty, like the tolling of bells. David's hands knew this. His muscles knew this. Even after all these years of swinging hammers and lifting steel beams, somewhere deep in the memory of his body, the music had been waiting. He pressed down on the first chord. The sound that filled the concert hall was perfect, rich and full, with just the right amount of force. It resonated through the space, bouncing off the high ceilings, reaching into every corner. That single chord said everything. It said, "I know what I'm doing." It said, "You were wrong about me." It said, "Listen." The second chord followed, then the third. David's left hand joined in, playing the deep bass notes that give the piece its dark, foreboding character. And then, without thinking, without doubting, he launched into the main melody. The change in the room was instant. You could actually feel it, like the air pressure had shifted. The smiles vanished first. Then the phones that had been raised to record what people expected to be an embarrassing moment stayed up. But now for a completely different reason. People leaned forward in their seats. Mouths opened slightly in surprise, because David wasn't just playing the notes correctly. He was playing them beautifully. His fingers moved across the keyboard with a speed and precision that seemed impossible for someone who worked with his hands the way he did. The rough, scarred fingers that looked like they belonged wrapped around a wrench were dancing across the keys with the grace of a trained pianist. Because that's exactly what he was. The years hadn't erased it. The calluses hadn't destroyed it. If anything, the decades of hard physical work had made his hands stronger, more controlled. The piece built in intensity. Rachmaninoff wrote this prelude when he was 19 years old, and it's full of young passion and drama. Loud, crashing chords alternate with soft, delicate passages. It demands both power and gentleness, and David gave it both. When the music called for thunder, his hands came down with the force of someone who'd spent years hammering nails and hauling lumber. When it needed whispers, those same hands became impossibly light, barely touching the keys, coaxing out sounds so soft they were almost felt rather than heard. In the 5th row, a woman brought her hand to her mouth. In the back, a man who'd been checking his email put his phone away completely. The conservatory students who'd performed earlier exchanged glances with each other. They knew how hard this piece was. They'd probably worked on it themselves, and here was this guy, this random construction worker, playing it like he'd been practicing it every day. But David wasn't thinking about any of that. He wasn't thinking about the audience at all anymore. He was inside the music now, the way he used to be all those years ago. The notes were carrying him along, and he was letting them. His body swayed slightly with the rhythm. His eyes were half closed. Somewhere in his mind, he was 22 again, playing for Professor Hartwick, playing because it was the only thing that made sense in the world. The middle section of the piece is particularly brutal. The right hand plays fast, repeating patterns, while the left hand provides a steady pulse underneath. It's exhausting even for trained pianists. But David's hands, strengthened by years of manual labor, didn't tire. If anything, they seemed to grow more confident as the piece progressed. The muscle memory was fully awake now, and it was like he'd never stopped playing at all. There's a moment about 3/4 through the piece where everything gets quiet. After all the drama and intensity, Rachmaninoff gives you this brief, gentle passage. It's like the eye of a storm. David played those measures with such tenderness that several people in the audience felt their eyes getting wet. There was something in the way he touched those keys, something that spoke of longing and loss and beautiful things that slip through your fingers. Then the storm returned. The final section of the prelude is even more powerful than the beginning. Massive chords, thundering bass notes, the right hand flying up and down the keyboard in fast scales. It's meant to be overwhelming, exhausting, triumphant. David threw everything he had into it. His whole body was engaged now. His shoulders, his back, his legs pushing against the floor for leverage. This wasn't just his hands playing. This was every part of him that had missed music for 25 years finally getting to speak again. In the audience, Professor Hartwick had her hand over her heart. She was 73 now, retired from the conservatory for 5 years, but she'd come to this charity event like she did every year. She'd been chatting with a friend when the MC called for volunteers, barely paying attention. But the moment David played that first chord, something in her recognized it. The sound quality, yes, but more than that, the feeling behind it. She'd leaned forward, squinting at the man on stage. It couldn't be. But as he continued playing, as she watched his posture and the way his hands moved, she knew. David Chen, the student who disappeared all those years ago without explanation. She'd asked about him, tried to find him, but he'd just vanished. She'd always wondered what happened, if he'd given up on music, if he'd found success somewhere else. Now here he was, playing better than he had even as a student. There was a depth to his playing now, an emotional weight that only comes from living a full life with all its joys and heartbreaks. The final chord was approaching. David could feel it building, the momentum carrying him toward that last massive sound. His hands spread wide across the keyboard, preparing. The audience was completely silent now, absorbed in every note. Even the people who didn't know classical music could feel that something special was happening. The last chord came down like a hammer. David's hand struck the keys with all the power he had, and the sound exploded through the concert hall. It was huge, overwhelming, final, the kind of chord that doesn't just end a piece but makes a statement. And David held it, let it ring out and slowly fade, his foot on the sustain pedal, letting the vibrations die naturally until the hall was silent again. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. David sat at the piano, his hands still on the keys, breathing hard. His heart was pounding. He felt like he'd just run a marathon, or like he'd just come home after being lost for 25 years. Then the applause started. The applause didn't just start. It erupted. One person stood up, then another. Then the entire room was on its feet. The sound washed over David like a wave, and for a moment he just sat there at the piano bench, stunned. His hands were shaking slightly, adrenaline coursing through his body. He'd forgotten what this felt like. Not just the playing, but this. The connection between performer and audience, the shared experience of music that touches something deep inside people. David stood up slowly and turned to face the crowd. The spotlight was bright in his eyes, making it hard to see individual faces, but he could feel their energy. These were the same people who'd been smirking and whispering 20 minutes ago. Now they were clapping so hard their hands had to hurt. Some of them had tears running down their faces. A man in the front row was shaking his head in disbelief, a huge smile on his face. The MC rushed back onto the stage, his own eyes glistening. He grabbed David's hand and shook it vigorously. "Ladies and gentlemen, that was absolutely extraordinary." His voice was thick with emotion. "I think we just witnessed something very special." The applause continued, growing louder if anything. David gave a small, awkward bow. He wasn't used to this kind of attention. For 25 years, he'd been invisible in a lot of ways. Just another guy in a hard hat, one of dozens of workers at a construction site. Nobody applauded when you framed a wall correctly or installed a window. The work got done, you got paid, you went home. This was something completely different. Then David saw movement in the crowd. An elderly woman was making her way down the aisle, moving as quickly as her age would allow. She had white hair pulled back in a neat bun, and even from the stage David could see she was crying. His breath caught in his throat. He knew that walk, that posture, even after all these years. Professor Hartwick. She climbed the steps to the stage, and the audience quieted down, sensing something was happening. The MC stepped aside, confused but respectful. Professor Hartwick stopped a few feet from David, her hand pressed to her chest, studying his face. "David Chen," she said, her voice carrying across the now silent hall. "I can't believe it's you." David felt his composure crack. His eyes filled with tears that he'd been holding back. "Hello, Professor." She closed the distance between them and pulled him into a tight hug. David hugged her back, and suddenly he was 22 years old again, saying goodbye to this woman who'd believed in him more than anyone except maybe his own parents. He'd left without explanation, too ashamed to tell her the real reason, too proud to admit he was giving up his dream for something as mundane as money and family obligations. "I looked for you," she said, pulling back to look at him, her hands still on his shoulders. "You just disappeared. I called your apartment, asked the registrar's office. No one knew where you'd gone." "I'm sorry," David managed to say. I should have told you. I just couldn't face it. The MC, realizing this was a moment the audience needed to hear, gently touched Professor Hartwick's arm. Perhaps you could share with everyone. I think we're all curious about this story. Professor Hartwick nodded, wiping her eyes with a handkerchief she pulled from her purse. She turned to address the audience, though she kept one hand on David's arm, as if afraid he might disappear again if she let go. This man, she said, her voice strong despite her tears, was one of the most gifted students I taught in 40 years at the Riverside Conservatory. He had a full scholarship. He was supposed to graduate with honors, and then one day he was just gone. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. David stood there feeling exposed but also oddly relieved. He'd carried this secret for so long, this story of sacrifice and loss. Maybe it was time to let it out. The MC handed him a microphone. David, would you be willing to tell us what happened? Only if you're comfortable, of course. David took the microphone, his hand unsteady. He looked out at all those faces staring at him, waiting. He saw Amy then sitting in the back row. His daughter was crying, smiling and crying at the same time, and he understood then that she'd known exactly what would happen tonight. She'd set this up somehow, given him this gift. My father had a stroke, David began, his voice quiet, 25 years ago. I was in my second year at the conservatory. The medical bills were overwhelming. My mother worked 2 jobs, but it wasn't enough. I was the oldest child. I had to help, he paused, swallowing hard. I didn't quit because I wanted to. I quit because my family needed me. Construction paid better than anything else I could do at the time. So I took a job, and then that job became my career, and 25 years went by in what feels like a blink. Someone in the audience let out a sob. Others nodded in understanding. These were people who knew about sacrifice, about making hard choices. Maybe not the same choices, but everyone had something they'd given up for family or duty or survival. I never stopped loving music, David continued, his voice growing stronger. Every single day for 25 years I thought about it. I'd walk past music stores and just stand there looking at the pianos in the windows. I'd listen to classical radio in my truck during lunch breaks. At night I'd lie in bed and my fingers would move through old pieces on my blanket, playing silently in the dark. Professor Hartwick was openly weeping now. So were a lot of other people. But I didn't regret my choice, David said firmly. My father lived for another 12 years after his stroke. I got to be there for him. I helped put my younger brother through college. I met my wife Linda because I was working construction on a building where she was teaching. We had our daughter Amy, who's here tonight. He looked toward the back row, found his daughter's face. She's the one who signed me up for this without telling me. Gave me a push I didn't know I needed. Amy was crying harder now, and Linda, sitting next to her, had her arm around their daughter's shoulders. Both of them were beaming with pride. The thing is, David said, his voice thick with emotion, I've had a good life. Not the life I planned, but a good one. I built houses that families live in. I helped build a school. I raised an amazing daughter. Those things matter too. They matter a lot. The MC wiped his own eyes. But you never stopped being a pianist, did you? Your hands remembered everything. David looked down at his scarred, calloused hands. I guess some things go deeper than we realize. The music was always there, just waiting. I thought maybe I'd lost it, but it was just sleeping. Professor Hartwick stepped forward again. You play with more depth now than you did as a student, she said. Back then you had technique and talent. Now you have life experience, pain and joy and sacrifice. That's what I heard in your playing tonight. That's what made everyone in this room stop breathing. A businessman in the third row stood up. He was wearing an expensive suit and had the look of someone important. Excuse me, he called out. I'm Robert Martinez. I'm on the board of the Westside Community Arts Center. We're opening a new facility next month, and we're looking for someone to run our piano program for underserved youth. He looked directly at David. Would you be interested in talking about this? David's mouth fell open. I'm not sure I'm qualified. I never finished my degree. You just played Rachmaninoff perfectly after not touching a piano for 25 years, Martinez said with a laugh. I think you're qualified. Professor Hartwick squeezed his arm. And I'd be happy to help you brush up on anything you need. Mentor you back into the teaching world properly, if you want. David looked between them, then out at the audience, then back at his family in the last row. Amy was nodding frantically, urging him to say yes. Linda was smiling that smile that meant she supported whatever he wanted to do. For the first time in 25 years, David felt something shift inside him. A door opening that he'd thought was locked forever. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe some dreams could come back to life. The weeks after that night at the charity event felt like living in a dream. David's performance had been recorded on dozens of phones, and by the next morning, videos were spreading across social media. Construction worker stuns crowd with Rachmaninoff, read one headline. Man plays piano after 25 years, brings audience to tears, said another. Within days, the story had gone viral, shared millions of times by people who were moved by his journey. David's phone wouldn't stop ringing. News stations wanted interviews. Magazines wanted to feature his story. But the call that mattered most came 3 days after the event. It was Robert Martinez from the Westside Community Arts Center, and he wasn't just being polite that night on stage. He had a real job offer. We need someone to build a piano program from the ground up, Martinez explained over coffee at a diner near David's house. Someone who understands what it means to have talent but no opportunity. Someone who knows what it's like to sacrifice dreams because of circumstances beyond your control. David stirred his coffee slowly, thinking, I've been doing construction for 25 years. The pay is steady. I have a mortgage, bills. I can't just walk away from that. We're not asking you to, Martinez said. Start part-time. 3 days a week teaching, 2 days on your construction job. See how it feels. The pay won't be amazing at first, but it's decent, and there's room to grow. Linda had been listening quietly from across the table. She reached over and put her hand on David's arm. You should do it, she said softly. You've been working construction for 25 years to take care of everyone else. Maybe it's time to do something for yourself. It's not just for me, though, David said, looking at the papers Martinez had brought. If I'm teaching kids, I have to do it right. I have to be there for them. That's exactly why you're the right person, Martinez said with a smile. Most of the teachers we interview talk about technique and theory. Important stuff, sure. But you're thinking about the kids first. That's what we need. David signed the papers that afternoon. The following Monday, he started his new schedule. Mornings at the construction site, afternoons at the art center. It was exhausting at first, juggling both jobs, but David found he didn't mind. For the first time in decades, he woke up excited about his day. The art center was in a neighborhood David knew well. He'd actually worked on buildings in this area years ago. It was a community that didn't have much, where families struggled to make ends meet. The kind of place where a kid with musical talent might never get the chance to develop it, because piano lessons cost money no one had. His first student was a 10-year-old girl named Teresa, who'd been banging on a broken keyboard at the community center for months, teaching herself from YouTube videos. When she sat down at a real piano for the first time in David's class, her eyes went wide with wonder. It sounds so different, she whispered, pressing one key and listening to the pure, clear note. David smiled, remembering the first time he'd played on a quality instrument. That's because this piano is properly maintained. The keys are weighted right, the strings are tuned. Makes all the difference. He had 7 students that first month. By the 3rd month, he had 23. Word spread quickly in the neighborhood. The construction worker who could play like a professional was teaching piano, and he understood kids who came from families without money. He understood what it meant to have big dreams in a world that didn't always make space for them. Professor Hartwick kept her promise too. She met with David every Sunday afternoon at her house, helping him brush up on teaching methods, sharing lesson plans she'd developed over 4 decades in the classroom. They'd drink tea and go through musical theory, and sometimes they'd just play together on her baby grand piano, taking turns, laughing when one of them made a mistake. You're a better teacher than you were a student, she told him one afternoon. You have patience now, understanding. You know how to meet people where they are. David thought about his construction crew, how he'd learned over the years to work with all kinds of people. The young guys fresh out of high school who didn't know which end of a hammer to hold. The older workers dealing with injuries and wondering how many years they had left. Everyone came to the job with their own story, their own struggles. He'd learned to see that, to adjust his expectations and his approach based on who he was working with. He brought that same awareness to teaching piano. Some kids learned fast and needed to be challenged constantly. Others needed more time, more encouragement, more patience. David never compared them to each other. He just met each student where they were and helped them move forward from there. 6 months into teaching, something unexpected happened. David's construction company landed a big contract and needed all hands on deck. His supervisor called him into the office, looking uncomfortable. "Look, David, we need you full-time on this project. It's 3 months of solid work, good overtime pay. But I know you've got that teaching thing going. So you need to choose. Are you a construction worker or are you a piano teacher?" David went home that night and sat at the kitchen table with Linda and Amy. They spread out the finances, looked at the numbers. The teaching job alone wouldn't quite cover their bills, not yet. The construction work paid better, and the overtime would give them a cushion they could definitely use. "What do you want to do?" Linda asked. David looked at his hands, still rough and scarred, but moving more fluidly now after months of daily playing. He thought about Teresa, who'd just played her first complete piece without any mistakes, her face glowing with pride. He thought about Miguel, the shy teenager who'd told him last week that piano was the only thing that helped when his anxiety got bad. He thought about all 23 students who were counting on him. "I want to teach," David said quietly. "The construction company will find another foreman. But those kids, they need someone who gets it, someone who understands what they're up against." Linda smiled. "Then teach. We'll figure out the money." They did figure it out, though it meant cutting back on some things. Fewer restaurant meals, no vacation that year, fixing things themselves instead of hiring help. But David was happier than he'd been in decades, and that made everything else easier to bear. The local news did a follow-up story on him 9 months after the viral video. They filmed him teaching at the Arts Center, showing his students practicing and improving. The reporter asked him if he had any regrets about the path his life had taken. David thought about it carefully before answering. "I used to think I'd lost 25 years, he said. Like that time was wasted because I wasn't doing music. But I don't see it that way anymore. Those years taught me things I needed to learn. About hard work and sacrifice and what really matters. About being there for people who need you. I couldn't teach the way I teach now if I hadn't lived the life I lived." A year after that night at the charity event, David performed there again. But this time he wasn't a surprise volunteer. He was the featured guest, introduced as the founder and director of the Westside Community Arts Center piano program. And he didn't perform alone. He brought 6 of his students with him, kids who'd never imagined they'd play on a stage like this. David played Rachmaninoff again, and it was just as powerful as the first time. But afterward, he brought Teresa to the piano and let her play the simple piece she'd been working on. Her hands shook with nervousness and she made a few mistakes, but the audience gave her a standing ovation anyway. Because they understood what David understood now. It's not about playing perfectly. It's about having the courage to try, to put yourself out there, to believe that maybe you deserve to make beautiful things even if the world tells you otherwise. That night, as David helped pack up music stands and sheet music, Professor Hartwick pulled him aside. "I'm proud of you," she said. "Not just for coming back to music, but for how you came back. You didn't do it for fame or recognition. You did it to help others find what you found." David looked across the hall at his students, all talking excitedly about the performance. Their faces lit up with joy. "They gave me something too," he said. "They reminded me why music matters. It's not about being the best or the most talented. It's about connection, about expressing things we can't say with words, about creating moments of beauty in a world that can be pretty hard sometimes." He went home that night and sat at the used upright piano they'd finally been able to afford, squeezed into a corner of their living room. It wasn't a concert grand. The keys stuck sometimes and it needed tuning more often than it should. But it was his, and when he played it, he was exactly where he needed to be. 25 years ago, David had walked away from music to take care of his family. Now music had come back to him, not to replace those years, but to give them meaning. Every sacrifice he'd made, every hard day of work, every choice that had seemed like an ending had actually been leading him here. To this moment, to this life where dreams deferred weren't dreams denied, just dreams that had been gathering depth and wisdom, waiting for their time to bloom. David played softly, not practicing anything in particular, just letting his fingers wander across the keys. In the next room, he could hear Linda and Amy laughing about something. Outside, the neighborhood was settling into evening quiet, and in his chest, where a small hollow space had lived for 25 years, there was finally peace. The kind of peace that comes from knowing you made the right choices, took care of the people you loved, and still somehow found your way back to the thing that makes your soul sing. Some stories don't have endings. They just have new beginnings again and again, for as long as you're brave enough to keep starting over.